Hey folks, Tim Newman with Soft Light Studios bringing you another installation in our ongoing series, Mastering Photoshop. In today's video, we're going to take a look at the Smart Sharpen filter in Photoshop. Now, in my estimation, there are two places where I like to apply sharpening in my Lightroom to Photoshop workflow. The first is the detail panel in Lightroom, which, by the way, is driving the detail control in Adobe Camera Raw underneath. And I think of that as my global sharpening tool for the image coming out of the camera before I do any other edits to it. Secondarily, I think of the Smart Sharpen filter in Photoshop as my localized contrast and sharpening tool that I apply to my image when I'm just about wrapped up with my localized edits. Let's take a look at how the Smart Sharpen filter works in Photoshop. So before I do any editing in Photoshop that I perceive to be destructive in nature, i.e. it's going to modify the original pixels in the image, I am going to go ahead and make a copy of that image into a new layer so that I can do my edits there. And if everything goes horribly awry, I can always turn that edited layer off or drag it in the trash, and my original image is safe in the background layer or in that layer below, having been untouched. Now, a lot of people believe that the history stack is the way to protect yourself against this, but there's something to keep in mind there, and that is every time you save and quit Photoshop, that history stack is dumped. So if you come back into Photoshop the next time, any edits that you made are now permanent edits with no history stack to reverse through to get back to where you started. So we're going to go ahead and make our copy here, and first of all, what we're going to do is come over here to the existing background layer. We're going to unlock it by clicking on this padlock. You see it goes away. It also gets a default name of layer 0. I'm going to double click on that name and I'm going to call it image because that's what it is. That's our image. And then on the Mac, I'm going to do a Command J, that's a Control J on Windows, and that will take that active layer and make a copy of it for us. And you can see it names it image copy. I don't want that to be the name. I'm going to double click on this and I am going to call this sharpening, because that's what we're doing with this layer. That's our sharpening layer. And so it makes it clear to us later what that layer was for and what its purpose was in the document. So we are all set to go here. If I decide I made a mistake here, I don't want this, I can turn the layer off. I can also drag the layer in the trash or just click on the trash can. Either one of those will work, and that layer is now gone. Obviously I want the layer back because we're getting ready to do some edits here. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back on, and now we're ready to start exploring the Smart Sharpen filter. Photoshop's Smart Sharpen filter, handy enough, hangs out under the filter menu. So if I come up here to filter in the main menu, come down here to sharpen, and then I work my way over to this second little navigation pop-up box here, you will see the Smart Sharpen dialog choice right here. So we're going to click on that, and here comes the Smart Sharpen dialog box for us ready to use. Now, before we jump into the sliders in this dialog box, let's take a quick look at the dialog box in general and note some of the things that make it work the way that it does. First of all, over here on the left, we have a really nice preview panel over here that also serves as a navigation panel. I can take this and move around to various areas in the document that I would like to zoom in on. We notice down here that our zoom ratio here, if you will, is 100%. And if you recall from previous discussions on zoom percentages in Photoshop, i.e. in the tabbed document interface, this is not viewing it at 100% size. This is viewing 100% of the pixels in the image. So as we zoom in here to the 800% maximum that we can get to, we can see that we start to see some pixelation in the image, and there are our pixels being displayed for. So we'll zoom back out to this 100%. We can even zoom out further if we'd like to see more of the image, but quite frankly, I like working at 100%. It really gives me an idea of what this thing is going to look like when I print it out at full size. Now, as we said, we can use this, what we would call the pan scroll tool, to move around what's in the preview window here. You'll also note that if we come off to the image itself, we get this nice little square navigation aid, and I can say, hey, I'd like to look here in the picture, or I'd like to look here in the picture. So I have a way of jumping around very quickly through the scene and putting it into the preview window and taking a look at it. And that's kind of a nice thing because, if you think about it, we're probably not too concerned about doing a lot of smart sharpening up here in the clouds, but we'd certainly like to do some smart sharpening here in the window panes on the new World Trade Center. Couple last things to explore here in the dialog box before we start breaking apart the sliders here. One is this preview checkbox right here. If the preview checkbox is on, you get to see real time the effects of slider changes that you made and how the Smart Sharpen filter is being applied. If you turn it off, you don't get to see those things, but then again, the render happens a little bit quicker without doing the preview. You only have to do it one time. I kind of like preview on. I like to see what I'm doing, but if you're in a performance constrained machine, might not be a bad idea to turn that off. You be the judge of that. Last but not least, over here we have this little gear drop-down dialog, if you will. And if I click on that, you see we get a couple choices. One is I can go to the legacy version of the Smart Sharpen filter, i.e. the one that is in Photoshop before this most current release, and I can turn on this thing called More Accurate, which back in the legacy version made the Smart Sharpen adjustments a little more accurate to the contrast edges that were in the image. Presumably, the more accurate feature does not exist when you turn off the legacy feature because the newer version should be more accurate by default. It's a better version. The other thing you'll notice happens when you go to the legacy version, the reduce noise filter goes away. So that's a new addition in the dialog box. One last thing to take a look at here, and that is the preset that we're using. Now, it was default when we loaded it up, but we kind of tweaked a couple of checkboxes there, so that made it a custom one. If we go back to default, this is the way it typically loads and all the settings that come with the default setting. So that would be the default Smart Sharpen filter that you're about to apply. As soon as you come in here and adjust a slider, you'll know it says, oh, now it's a custom. Let's say, for example, that you shot 50 images of the same scene, minor tweaks in subject or background, but by and large, it was the same frame. You could actually come in here, build a Smart Sharpen set of selections here, and then save that as a preset, and then subsequently apply it to all 49 other images in that shoot. So that's kind of a handy thing to do as well. So there's the dialog box in a nutshell. Now let's start to tear apart the sliders that exist here within this dialog box. The first slider that we want to explore here in the Smart Sharpen filter dialog box is the amount slider. And the amount slider is a slider that dictates the overall sharpening that's going to happen to the image when this filter is applied. Now, saying overall is a bit of a misnomer because when we understand how sharpening works, we begin to realize that sharpening is really localized edge contrast. And an edge in Photoshop is really where light pixels and dark pixels meet one another in the image. And pixels that are on the lighter side of that meeting are made even lighter, and pixels that are on the darker side of that meeting are made even darker. So wherever Photoshop can locate those edges of contrast, it's going to apply that contrast change in shifting brightness and darkness in those corresponding pixels. So that's a good thing to know because it really explains how the sharpening gets localized when it's applied to an image via this filter. Let's explore the radius slider next here in the Smart Sharpen dialog box. Now, the radius slider is responsible for telling Photoshop, when it applies this filter, how far from a contrast edge in terms of pixels it should apply that localized adjustment. i.e., on the lighter side of the contrast edge, we're going to go, in this case, 3 pixels out. And on the darker side of that contrast edge, we're going to go 3 pixels out in that direction. So the fact that this works this way really underscores why Adobe recommends that you have selected a final output size for the image prior to using the Smart Sharpen filter here. So imagine if you have a smaller image, you probably want to have a smaller radius setting here so it doesn't become an obvious adjustment along those contrast edges. Conversely, if you're going to a rather large image or a rather large print as your output, then you can probably bump this radius up and get cleaner, more evident sharpening along those contrast edges. Now, if you start to notice that you're seeing some halos along those contrast edges, dialing the radius slider back is probably a good first step to minimizing or making those halos go away altogether. The reduce noise slider, as we noted a little bit earlier, is a new addition to the Smart Sharpen filter in Photoshop, and it's really handy in reducing ISO noise when you're starting to increase the sharpening amount in this filter. Now, sharpening in general has a tendency to create noise in an image. So as you are bringing up the amount of sharpening that you're adding in this filter, it is likely that you'll probably want to bump up the reduce noise slider as well, as that will try to dial that noise increase back. Let's take a look at the remove options here in the Smart Sharpen filter dialog box. Now, by and large, of the three choices that are available to you here, you're going to want to stick with lens blur, as it is the one blur removal type that actually supports edge detection and works in conjunction with the amount slider to provide sharpening at that localized level right where contrast edges are. The Gaussian blur option here basically takes this tool and makes it operate the exact same way the unsharp mask filter does, allowing for global sharpening but no edge detection being supported, and localizing the sharpening efforts or the micro contrast efforts that you would see this filter normally be able to perform. And then last but not least, this motion blur choice here, while it does do sharpening, is really targeted at looking for softness in the image that is a result of movement during the exposure and trying to compensate against that. And then you can take that motion blur and dial in an angle that you want to have that motion blur be removed. Presumably, you would try to isolate the angle of movement as you're looking at the image and see if you can't counteract that with the angle that you dial in here. That's a little bit tricky to do, but this filter would then support that. So our lens blur option here is the one that's really going to give us the best sharpening. Now, when you check any of these removal types, it's going to take Photoshop a second to update that preview so you can see what's happening here. Now let's take a look at the shadows and the highlights sliders down here in this area of the Smart Sharpen filter dialog box. This is going to take a little bit of kind of dissecting these sliders apart to understand exactly what's happening here. So the fade amount in both the shadows and in the highlights areas basically says, for whatever we're doing up here in terms of sharpening, fade off this amount of that effect at the shadow end and at the highlight end of the tonal range of the image. Now right here, our fade amount for shadows is set to 0 and our fade amount for highlights is set to 0. So we're not affecting any of the sharpening that we're doing above here in this shadow and highlights areas. Now, if we dial this up to 50%, for example, now what we're saying is in the shadows area and in the highlights area of this image, ratchet back these settings here by 50%. So while this might be sharpening at a specific amount, do about 50% of that sharpening here in the shadows and in the highlights. And of course, these don't have to be set the same. I could say, well, dial back 50% of the sharpening that you're doing in the shadows, but dial back only 25% of the sharpening that you're doing in the highlights. So you can really skew one end or the other, or keep them matched if you would like. Now that works in conjunction with the tonal width slider here. So if I say my tonal width slider here is down to 0 in the shadows and it's down to 0 in the highlights, I'm really affecting only the absolute darkest shadows here in this image and only the absolute brightest highlights here in this image. As I start to push these tonal widths up in terms of the percentage amounts, I'm then saying, okay, up above where we're pushing up the tonal width for shadows, we're saying push up a ways into some of the midtones and go from the darks to the midtones in adjusting shadows. And here, go from the highlights back down to the midtones in the opposite direction and grab those. So what we're doing is we're really kind of expanding the range from the shadow end inward and from the highlight end inward in terms of overall tonality of the image. And then, of course, this combined with what we've set up here for the fade amount gives us kind of a gradual adjustment to sharpening in the shadows and in the highlights up to the tonal level that we've specified here. If we wanted to allow the settings above to come in across the range of tonality, we could simply take the fade amount, both of these cases, and put them to 0 and say put the tonal width to 100%. Now we're getting no fade to the effect above, and we're allowing it to go all the way across the tonal width. So what we're doing here is we're saying, hey, let this sharpening happen across the image as a whole. If we come up here and say, okay, dial the fade amount to 50% here, more or less, and 50% here, more or less, then what we're doing is we're saying here from the darks to the midtones and here from the highlights to the midtones, apply about 50% of the sharpening amount that we would normally see here in the middle of the tonal range. Last but not least here, we can control the radius that these two sliders are looking at in terms of pixels. So it's going to take a look at a pixel and it's going to look around that pixel in a radius to determine whether or not that cluster of pixels qualifies for being inside these settings here or being outside the settings here. So the larger we make this radius in both of these cases, the more that we're controlling sharpening in the shadows, and conversely, the more that we're controlling sharpening here in the highlights. I hope that explanation kind of cleared all these sliders up, because these have really great ability to control sharpening in your shadows, where of course there is typically more noise, and sharpening in your highlights, where there is typically the potential for haloing. So the combination of the two of these set correctly can really dial in how sharpening is applied at the darkest and lightest tones in your image. With all of those in mind, really comes down to each image is going to have its own look and feel. So I might come up here and say, well, I'd like to apply 300% sharpening, and I'm going to really dial back the pixel radius on this, maybe to 2 pixels. So I'm going to tighten that up quite a bit. I'll reduce noise down here into the 20% mark, because as noise is pulled out of the image that's created by sharpening, reducing noise in the image also cuts out some of the sharpness in the image. And then I think I'll come back here and I'll just say, all right, down here and in the shadows and the highlights, I'm not going to affect sharpening at all. I'm going to take my tonal width and leave it cranked wide open here. And then maybe I will dial the radius back to about 5 pixels, both in the shadows and the highlights. And then I'm just really watching here in my preview, how is this affecting the image in terms of how it's sharpening up this area that I'm zoomed in on. And I may click around in a couple of areas here and kind of look at some of the textured areas of the image and see, how is this sharpening working out with this particular image? Now, let's say, for example, I really crank up the radius here. Now, we'll give this a few seconds, but you can see by cranking up the radius on this sharpening that's happening up here, I'm really starting to see detail in and behind the glass reflections here in the image, which may or may not be a good thing. I'm not so sure that's so great, so maybe I'll drop this down a little ways, and you begin to see that we start to develop some opacity in here a little better, maybe even a little more, down to a couple pixels is the way to go. And then you can see that we're really seeing now more of the reflection on the building than looking in through the glass reflection, if you will. And you know, it's worth just kind of playing with one of these things. What happens here if I adjust the radius in the shadows and I say, okay, dial back the sharpening effect in the shadows? And hopefully what we'll do is we'll see the darks start to clean up here a little bit. And we'll do the same thing here. Let's take maybe a 20 pixel radius in the highlights and say, let's really dial back the fade amount here by 25% instead of 50% that we did up here. But now what I'd like to do is I'd really like to keep this constrained to the brightest tones in the image, and thereby cranking this tonal width back, you can see that I picked up just a little bit of a shift in the highlights there, fairly subtle. So now if I go ahead and apply this filter, we're going to go ahead and set this filter into motion. We'll have it go ahead and process itself and then apply itself to the image. If I come in here, now this is essentially the same as looking at a preview when the filter was open, but if I turn this sharpening on and off, I should be able to see the effect of the filter being applied here in the image and see things kind of clean up in a very smooth way. If I really wanted to zoom in to that 100% level, this is where I can now turn this filter on and off and probably have a little bit cleaner look. You can see it there in the patterns of those panels. As soon as I turn sharpening on, it becomes a little more distinct. It's a subtle thing, except for that spot healing brush that I just did. Let me hold down my space bar here to get my pan scroll tool. I don't want sharpening to be incredibly obvious. I want it to be a very clean effect that cleans up the image overall and makes it look a lot better. And I think that's what we've got here, is exactly that happening. Well, there you have it, folks, the Smart Sharpen filter in Photoshop. I hope now that we've explored the sliders in the dialog box and you're beginning to understand the interaction between them, it's become clear to you how you can use this filter to apply localized sharpening to your images in Photoshop, even going as far as being able to control the tonal areas where the sharpening gets applied. I hope this video has been helpful to you, as are the rest of our videos that we bring to you on a regular basis. If this is the case, please consider mashing that red subscribe button down below. And remember, as we always say, learning equals skills, practice equals mastery. We'll see you out there.